Hey everyone! Today I'm going to walk you through how to sew a padded Jasmine and Romy bra. So this is one that I've sewn earlier, and I'm just going to open it up so you can see the inside. So it still has a mesh lining, but between the mesh and the exterior layer I've used cut and sew foam. So cut and sew foam comes in a bunch of different colors. I generally try to keep on hand just some neutrals like beige, black, and ivory. So this is a piece that I've been cutting from. And you'll notice that the foam in one direction has some stretch and the other direction does not really have any give. So you want the stretch to be going around the garment. So I'm going to start off with the Jasmine bra, and I've cut out all of my pieces. These are the front two pieces. So this is my center front and my side front piece. And I've cut out mesh lining, my exterior fabric, which in this case is a lace. And I've cut out my foam pieces. And again, so that the stretch is going horizontally around the garment. I know sometimes when you're using foam, you cut off the seam allowance. I'm not going to do that here. So you just cut them out just like you would any other fabric. So I'm going to start by assembling the cups. So because I'm using a stretch lace, the assembly is going to be slightly different than if you were using just a regular like jersey fabric. I'm posting a tutorial on my blog that will show you how to use a regular jersey fabric with a like a fold over elastic binding along the upper edge. But this one I'm going to show you how to use a lace and how to maintain the scalloped edge. So the assembly is really similar to how we would assemble just a regular Jasmine bra. So I'm taking one of my center front foam pieces and I'm going to layer my my lace on top of my foam. And then underneath that is going to be my mesh against the back. And then I'm going to take my lace side, lay that together, my foam side front, lay that together, and then flip it over. And take my mesh side front and layer that so that now that center front piece is sandwiched between my side front lining and then my side front lace and side front foam. So it's quite thick. So just be careful while you're sewing. So I'm using my regular sewing machine. And you can either use a very narrow zigzag stitch or you can use just a regular straight stitch. And we're going to sew through all of these layers. So I would recommend pinning it just to keep everything together. Or if you've sewn a million of these like I have, you can go ahead and just kind of fiddle with it as you're going through. So I've got all my layers here ready to go through the sewing machine, and I'm just kind of making sure they're all lined up so that the seam allowance is all lined up along that outer edge. I find it's difficult to pin when you're working with this many layers. Just be as precise as you can be. Try not to stress too much about it. If you make a mistake, everything can be fixed. That's the nice thing about sewing, because I make lots of mistakes. Alright, so sew right to the end of your lace there. So here is my finished piece. So I've got just pretty much like when you sew a regular Jasmine bra following my instructions. You've got the seam allowance is encased between your exterior layers and your lining, but because we've used foam, it's super, super bulky. So at this point, we're going to take a pair of nice sharp scissors and very, very carefully trim just the first layer of foam as close to your stitching line as possible. So the way I do cut and sew foam is a little different, but I did a bunch of experimenting and I found that this was the easiest way, the easiest and quickest way. All right, and then the other piece of foam here, we want to cut it back as well. It's a little bit more tricky because we've got fabric on either side. Go. So now we've eliminated a lot of that bulk in between there. So at this point what we're going to do is fold this side front lining just towards the front so that we can access all of our seam allowance, and then also make sure your lace is pulled towards the center front. And what we're going to do is we're going to use a zigzag stitch to stitch all of this seam allowance onto this foam. So again, you've got your side front, just pull it towards the center front, and the side front lining, pull that towards the center front, and we're stitching the seam allowance down. So I use a zigzag stitch, and you want to stitch as close to the seam line as possible. So here you can see I've moved all of my seam allowance just towards this side front, and I'm stitching through my seam allowance and the side front foam only. So ideally what you're going to do is you're just going to catch that trimmed back foam, and your zigzag stitch is going to flatten it so that you have a nice flat seam. And your zigzag stitching is not going to be visible on the either the inside or the outside of the garment. It gets hidden between the layers. So here you can see I've zigzag stitched the seam allowance to this side front foam piece, and that's really helping that seam to lay flat. So there's just one more thing that we need to do, and it's just to cut this all this excess seam allowance back close to your zigzag stitching. So again, we're just stitching through the seam, or cutting through the seam allowance only, and this just eliminates any bulk at your seam. So there that is, and then when we pull our lining back over, we've got a nice flat seam, and we still have this nice soft lining against the skin. There we go, that's our first side. Now at this point with the lace variation, what I would do is just trim back this upper edge of foam and lining so that it's not coming up above any of your scallops. Because once we get our back band on, we're going to add some elastic along the inside, and we don't want this edge to show. So I'm just going to very carefully trim that back. Whoops. There, so that's our finished cup. So I'm going to fast forward a little bit and finish the other side, and then we'll get to sewing on the band, the back band, and finishing with all of our elastics. So I finished both sides of the front of my Jasmine bra with lining with lining and padding. So you can see they're both done. And now I'm going to sew on my band. So I've cut out my band pieces in scallop stretch lace as well as mesh. I've done some mesh on this just because this is really kind of fairly stable lace, but it's got a lot of holes in it. So I just thought that the mesh backing would be nice. So I'm basically going to do the sandwich method again to encase this side seam between my layers. So on this piece, I've actually just basted along the bottom of my cup just to keep my lining pieces in place. And then I'm going to place my band along that straight side seam, and I'm just making sure that the scallops line up at the top, and then flipping it over. I'm going to put my lining on this side. So you could put a couple pins in that if you wanted to, or just go ahead and stitch down here. So here's my finished side seam, and it's just like our cup seam that we sewed, and the seam allowance gets encased between the lining and exterior layers. So just like before, I'm going to trim back my foam. It's a little less important here that you get that you trim it back as close as possible. Okay, and then so at this point you could do a zigzag stitch just to secure your seam allowance in place, but I think I'm just going to leave it. My seam allowance isn't that noticeable through my fabric. So you can do the exact same thing to the opposite side. So attach the band along the side seam, lining up your scalloped edge. And then the lining on the opposite side, or on the inside. And then stitch that together with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So I've attached both bands, or the band to either side of my bra, and I'm still going to keep it in 2 halves at this point, and I'm going to take some elastic. I'm using this elastic that's about just under 1/2 inch, maybe 3/8 of an inch wide, and it's a fairly narrow elastic, but you can use any kind of elastic that's a similar color to your garment. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a multi-step zigzag stitch to just stitch it along the foam edge to the inside. And what this is going to do is it's going to hide this cut edge. So before I do that, I'm just going to make sure that none of my foam is poking above the lowest point of my scallop, which it is here. So I'm just going to carefully trim my foam back one more time just to make sure everything is looking good. So I have my sewing machine set to a wide multi-step zigzag stitch, and I'm working on the inside of my garment so that my elastic is just running on top of this raw, or this cut edge of my foam along the neckline edge. So you can gently pull on the elastic. This kind of contours the upper edge. And make sure you're using a bobbin thread that is the same color as your exterior fabric. Your elastic shouldn't come above the lowest point of your lace. It should just kind of run just below it. You don't want to see the elastic from the outside. So that really cleans up that upper edge and secures everything in place. And you can see from the outside that lets us maintain our nice scalloped edge all along the upper side of the bra. So at this point, your assembly is pretty much the same as in the instructions for the Jasmine bra. So you're going to sew your center front seam, and I just stitched through all of the layers. So I'm going to do that really quick. So to finish that seam, you have a couple of options. You can press it open and run a couple of lines of straight stitching down either side of the seam and then trim back your fabric. Or you can do a zigzag stitch that goes over top of your seam and then trim it back. So I think on this one, I'm going to do just a zigzag stitch. So just pressing that open with my fingers. I'm working from the inside. I'm going to do a really wide zigzag stitch and a little back tack. So I'm just going right over the seam allowance, or right over the seam. And then from there, just trim it back. So you could also finish this with some seam tape. But this is just a quick and easy way. Just be careful not to cut a hole in your lining when you're trimming that back. So there we have that. And from the front, because I've used a fabric that's pretty much the same, or sorry, a thread that's the same color as my fabric, those stitches just disappear. So the next step is to sew our band elastic, and I'm making this bra for myself, so I'm going to use a wider elastic. I'm going to use a 3/4 inch elastic. And this is exactly the same as in the instructions. So I'm just adjusting my zigzag stitch so it's a little less wide. And flush side of the elastic is facing up, and I'm sewing it directly onto the right side of the garment, pulling it as I go. So you're stitching through all the layers, including the foam. Just be careful because it does get really thick. And then, as always, just trim back all of your excess. Trim as close as you can to your stitching line, and that's especially important along this padded area because it gets really bulky along here. Okay, so switching back over to a multi-step zigzag stitch as wide as you can do. Fold the elastic towards the inside of the garment and top stitch that in place. So here, across the cups where we've added the padding, it gets a little harder to fold. And just go slowly and go carefully. So that's basically it. At this point, you can attach your back closure and your straps, but that is how I use cut and sew padding to line my Jasmine bra. Next, I'm going to show you how to do the Romy bra because it's a little bit different, but in essence, using any cut and sew foam for any of my bra patterns is going to be pretty much the same process. So I'm hoping once you learn these techniques, you can apply them to some other patterns. And I know for myself, I'm definitely going to be using this to make myself a swimsuit because I love the idea of having a little bit of padding in a swimsuit just for support. Like I said before, my preference is still for an unlined bra. I just prefer the fit and the feel of just a more kind of natural look than the foam. But this is a great option for somebody who wants maybe a little bit more, just a little bit more body or just a little bit more support in your bra. One thing to note about using the foam is it does limit the vertical stretch on the bra. So if you have a larger cup size, I would recommend adding some extra height to the pattern before you cut it out, just because it is not going to stretch quite as much as it would if you were sewing it out of like a stretch lace or stretch mesh or a cotton lycra jersey. Anyways, in my next video, I'll show you how to pad the Romy bra, and let me know if you are able to use this and show me some pictures on Instagram. Tag me in your photos so I can see what you're sewing. Thanks a lot. Bye.